All right, hello everyone. Today's video is going to be a little different. Instead of a lesson, it's going to be a conversation with a fellow teacher here at John Champe High School. I say here, I'm obviously at home, but one of my colleagues at John Champe High School in Aldie, Virginia, Erin Prokopchak. She teaches Latin, all 5 or 6 levels that are offered, from beginning Latin all the way to AP Latin, and she's been at Champ I think since it's been open in 2012, and I've known her. We went to school in the same area in Central Virginia, and during this time I thought it would be interesting to have a conversation with her about rhetoric as it pertains to her studies of Latin and the classics, the Romans. So I wasn't really sure what I was gonna get from that conversation, but I was very pleased. I think we had a very interesting discussion about rhetoric, and I'm going to shut up and get to that conversation. But I wanted to mention that first, I wanted to emphasize how grateful I am that she participated in this, because Lord knows we spend enough time in front of the computers right now, and she made extra time to not only talk to me about it, but also prepare some slides that worked me through it. So I hope you enjoy it, and I'm so grateful for her for participating. And near like the final 5 minutes, you can hear my son in the background a little bit, and my wife had to start a meeting of her own online nearby. So if you hear some things, that's what you hear. I don't think it's that distracting, but especially if you know what it is. But if you don't, you might be like, what in God's name is going on in the background? So anyway, I hope you enjoy this conversation about the Circus of Rhetoric in Rome.
I have to be honest, I really don't know that much about Greek anything. I mean, even though I was a classics major in college, I got away with really only Latin. That was what I knew and what I was good at. And I took 1 semester of Greek, but it didn't stick. And
was it ancient or modern?
Yeah, ancient Greek. And the school that I went to, you're familiar with Lynchburg, right? You lived in Lynchburg for a while. So I went to Randolph-Macon Women's College.
Oh, okay.
And when I was there many, many years ago, classics majors, there were 3 types. You could do Latin language, you could do Greek language, or you could do archaeology. And so I did Latin language. So I got away with not learning that much about Greek anything.
Was there a hierarchy or a infighting between the 3 subdivisions? No?
Because at Randolph-Macon, there were like 750 students. So in my graduation year, there were literally 1 of each of us. So I did Latin. My friend Emily did Greek, and my friend Sarah did archaeology. And so, I mean, between the 3 of us, like, there certainly was not any competition. And we had 2 professors. So that was what was crazy about a place like that there were in our senior capstone, we called it senior seminar, there were 2 professors, both the Latin and Greek professor, and the 3 students, and that was it.
Gotcha.
So very personalized experience.
Well, when you were studying in college, even though you were focused on Latin, and like you talk about and you're going to talk about in this presentation, the Romans, when they kind of took power and I guess kind of borrowed/stole lots of ideas and concepts from the Greeks, one of those things that they took from them was the art of rhetoric and public speaking, right?
There are those who are Hellenists, which are the studiers of Greek, and those who are Latinists, who are the studiers of Latin.
Yeah.
And those of us who are Latinists believe that yes, even though the Romans did borrow extremely heavily from the Greeks, there is a lot of Roman culture which is truly Roman.
Okay.
That, you know, everyone who is a true Hellenist, a true, you know, Greek enthusiast will say that everything that the Romans did was just completely stolen from the Greeks. And so, like, in this presentation, there is a lot of it's very Roman centric. It's all about what the Romans gave to the art of public speaking, or the circus of public speaking, and how they employed it for their own purposes, which may or may not have had anything to do with what the Greeks, used it for.
Cool. Right. So yeah, so when we're talking about Latin and Roman rhetoric, we're talking about the Republic, when there was some semblance of a democracy, and it was not ruled by just one emperor.
Yeah.
Okay. Perfect.
Itself. Yeah.
So when I was asking you if you talk to me a little bit about it, I sent you some sort of ideas for different areas we could discuss, and I based it around, I tell my students when they analyze a text, they need to be thinking about who is speaking, the purpose of speaking, the context in which they're speaking, the audience, and then the exigence or the driving forces that compel them to speak. So it looks like this presentation that you have is going to touch on a lot of those different elements. So it looks like you're starting off with who is speaking.
Yes. I figured that this was an important piece of background information as far as like culture, I guess. Yeah. So when it came to public speaking, that was the game of the elites, okay? The patrician class is the highest of the high class. They are the sort of noble class of Rome, and they are extremely wealthy. We're talking definitely 1%ers here. And they were the ones who learned and practiced oratory almost exclusively, because that was really the basis of their education. In Rome, when you were a little kid, like early elementary age, you were taught by your parents very basic things, like your gross motor skills and things like that. Yeah. Yeah. But also your set of morality, which was pietas, which is loyalty to the gods and to Rome and to your family. Wow. Then in your schooling age, 6 to 14, something like that, you would go to a tutor. Or sometimes it could be like a consortium. There would be several families that would hire one tutor. And you would learn your basic math and your reading, literature, usually grammar, those sorts of things, because Latin is a bit of a complex language. And then about 15 to 18, so like upper high school, is when these boys, really only boys, girls were taught until probably about 10 or 11 or 12 or so. So they learned along with boys. But then they were really honestly trained to be mothers after that. It's strange to us to think like about 11 or 12, you start to, get into your motherly role. But yeah. For the Romans, at that point, boys would learn other sort of academic topics, especially philosophy and public speaking, from a rhetor, which is the Latin word, it comes from Greek, which is for a public speaking teacher.
Interesting. So I teach Lang and I'm the speech coach. So my career descends from that, right?
Yeah, you definitely be a rhetor. And I tell my students that in Latin 1, 2, 3, and about half of 4, I am definitely a grammatica. I'm definitely a grammar teacher. And then in the second half of 4 and 5 and AP, I'm definitely a rhetor for them. So I teach them all about their literature and public speaking.
Do you think that part of the reason that speaking was so heavily emphasized was partly because there wasn't, this is before the printing press, so yeah. Books and written material was such a luxury even for the 1%. So much of like intellectual exploration had to be done verbally, or is that okay?
Yeah, I would say it is a combination of that practical element and also cultural, which I'm sure had to do with the time. They believed in holding a lot of things in memory. They believed in almost every bit of poetry and everything was spoken out loud. It was not meant to be read because it was inconvenient. You either had a wax tablet that you could, carve words into, or you could write on a piece of like actual parchment or papyrus, which was extremely expensive and hard to come by. And so important things were written down like that, like contracts. But
Gotcha.
you wouldn't waste paper just, writing thoughts.
Gotcha.
So yeah, it was.
So if you were a patrician, no matter what career you were heading into, it was very important that you were able to express yourself convincingly and effectively if you wanted to succeed.
Right. And I mean, obviously, there were a few people for whom they were so wealthy that they really didn't have to have a career. But generally speaking, a lot of these boys, I would say most of them, went straight to the military and then straight to politics. They were from the senatorial class. They knew that they were going to be senators. And so that was just sort of the path that was defined for them. Some did go on to be lawyers. Obviously, public speaking was necessary for them. And of course, there were a very few who went on to be scholars and things like that. Interestingly to note, most tutors of children were actually Greek slaves. And so that is really demonstrates how inextricably linked slavery was in the ancient Roman world. It's hard to, almost no element of life was void of slavery.
Didn't the Romans also, they would literally like send their kids to Athens to study rhetoric?
Often. Mm-hmm.
And
I think that depended on if you had, personal connections, that sort of thing.
Right. Ovid, who was like a contemporary of, I think Caesar or Caesar Augustus, he was a Roman poet, or no, he became a poet. He wanted to study to be a lawyer, right? And then he decided to shift into poetry. But he was also one of those like patricians who was tutored by the Greeks, right? But was Roman. Okay. Gotcha. That's interesting. I didn't know that they were slaves, the tutors.
Yeah, very frequently. Not if they were living in Rome. Oftentimes they were purchased by a family to use as their tutor for their children. And I mean, I guess if you were to send off your children to study in Greece, probably with free people. But yeah, that was very common.
Gotcha. Cool. Well, what can we say about like the purpose of a lot of the rhetoric? And I guess this kind of ties into your next slide. Like what was rhetoric commonly employed for in ancient Rome?
It was mostly useful in two realms. I said law and politics for the most part. I'm sure that people did, argue for the sake of arguing at, dinner parties and things like that. But as a career, you would need to be a good public speaker if you were going to be a lawyer. So cases like today, there were some civil and criminal. That's a different kettle of fish, which is also a long explanation. But what any casual person needs to know is that Roman law courts were not like they are today. There was very little basis in evidence. There was no concept of innocent until proven guilty. Cases did not need to be airtight in any sort of way. What mattered was that you could speak, or you had a lawyer who could convince any sort of judges that you or your client or whoever was either innocent or guilty. And so they were kind of a circus. In fact, these lawyers would hire people to watch and to cheer and even block the entrance so that, your opponents couldn't even get into the court.
So were there juries or was there just a judge?
There was a series of judges.
Okay.
Different numbers, and they were called different things depending on the different, if it was a criminal case or if it was a civil case, something like that.
Huh. That's interesting.
Yeah.
I like that, or I find it interesting because a lot of times we try to talk about how our society has degraded so much in the way we express ourselves. And obviously there's tons of areas for improvement, but I mean, that sounds like a complete mess. And I think our modern legal system is a little more effective than just, hiring like you would get booted out if you started cheering and trying to bring in your whole crew to applaud for you every time you spoke at a trial. So.
Yeah, I mean, if you think of like some sort of like ridiculous court movie or something like that, that's probably what the ancient Roman world was like. And I mean, they culturally they didn't really have much in the way of evidence. I mean, like forensic science wasn't a thing, I mean, that really developed in the 80s or whatever. So that was what they relied on. The wealthier you were, the more effective a lawyer you could hire, and the more likely that you would
win your case.
Yeah, win your case, be acquitted, or whatever the case may be.
Wow. So so how was that different in politics?
Probably not much. So in politics, the usually senators, that's where this happened a lot in the Senate, would make very long and detailed speeches to convince each other to vote for laws. I cited here In Catilinam, which is an extremely famous speech that the orator Cicero gave against this man who was accused of trying to overthrow Rome. There were actually 3 Catilinarian conspiracies, and probably only one of them was actually true. And later it was discovered some evidence that this man, Catilina, had hired some mercenaries to try to overthrow Rome. So maybe he was a bit of a threat. But,
and Cicero was speaking against them?
Yes.
Okay.
Cicero was speaking for the Republic against this man who was accused. And so eventually Catiline was convicted of trying to overthrow Rome, and he was exiled. And so that was a situation where what Cicero was saying was there was actually probably some truth behind it and those sorts of things. But Cicero actually got himself in a little bit of trouble at the very end of the Republic because he spoke against Julius Caesar, the great dictator of Rome. And he may have played a part in convincing Brutus and Cassius and those other senatorial conspirators to assassinate Julius Caesar. Although Cicero himself did not have a hand in the assassination, he was actually assassinated for planting the bug, so to speak.
He's featured in, very briefly, he's in the play Julius Caesar. And he's referenced early on before you see him. I think it's Cassius and Brutus are discussing him speaking at the Senate, but they mentioned that he spoke Greek, and that Cassius didn't understand.
Oh, okay.
And he's kind of depicted as, I guess he was like kind of an old timer at the time at which Caesar got assassinated, right?
Yes.
But that's interesting and ironic, I guess, that he would. Well, I guess it wasn't ironic because he was trying to preserve the Republic in Catiline. How do you say it? In
Catilinam. In means against in this context. So against Catiline was the
and so he was killed because he was implicated in the plot against Caesar.
More or less, yeah. He Cicero was nothing if not a staunch believer in the Republic. And so he sort of saw the writing on the wall that Julius Caesar was becoming a little bit too powerful in his mind, that he was not ceding power when he should have, and how Rome was sort of declining in its sort of republican state and becoming an empire.
Gotcha.
And he spoke very freely about it, and may have influenced some other people to take some drastic action.
And Caesar was famously an amazing rhetorician himself, right?
That's a good question. I don't really know that much about him as far as public. He was an incredible politician, and he got a lot of people to jump on his bandwagon. However, he managed to do that. Some of that was through his acting abilities, I guess. He portrayed himself as being very low class, even though he wasn't really. He was very generous with his money, which had a lot of influence on a lot of people. And he was a very convincing writer as well. And so people believed what he said that way.
Okay. So his skills were much greater than just being able to speak and convince a crowd of people. He could do things beyond that. Okay.
We're unmatched.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Cool. So I see you're talking about the difference between, we've talked a little bit about Greek versus Roman culture and the way that they spoke. So this is interesting. I wasn't familiar with this distinction here.
So again, I'm really not an expert as far as Greek anything, although in most speeches you hear about logos, ethos, and pathos.
Mm-hmm.
Logos means logic and proof.
Right.
Romans were not really much into that. They believed in convincing your opinions of what you believe in, and really rely on not much proof of anything. Ethos is credibility or trust. I would say that that's pretty universally true. If you have a good reputation, then that will go a long way, regardless of who you are or where you are. Pathos is emotions and values. The Romans, most of their speeches were probably mostly pathos. They appeal to your values and that sort of thing. For example, if someone were in a court case and they wanted to, regardless what the charge was, they could simply throw out that this person was a bad Roman, or that they, did things that were immoral, and that could help win the case for the defendant and sink the case for the what am I trying to say?
For the defendant.
Either way. So in ancient Rome, oratory had some conventions. Orators had some conventions that they used. A lot of ways of speaking to make their speech memorable in the sense of easily remembered by their audience. Cicero and other orators were famous for using triads, or a tricolon crescens, which was sets of 3 things. When your list has 3 things, like ethos, pathos, logos, it's easier to remember sets of 3 than sets of 4 or sets of 7 or something like that. And your tricolon crescens is when your set of 3 goes from smaller to larger items. He was a bad person, and he was even worse when it came to politics, and he was the most bad of all when it comes to religion, something.
Gotcha.
Like that.
Building up in severity. Yeah.
There are tons and tons and tons of these devices that the Romans used. My Latin 4s, 5s, and 8ps, learn them all. But here are some that are kind of easy to remember. Like anaphora is when you have the repetition of something at the beginning. I'm thinking of Julius Caesar's, Antony's speech from the play Julius Caesar, when he says, "Friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears." So there's a triad itself. And he says, he's ambitious over and over again. I can't remember. It's been a while since I've seen the play, but something about he was an ambitious man, something like that.
Well, he does do a ton of repetition in the way he will begin phrases and answer them himself, and he certainly builds it I don't know if you could say he does the rule of three in the way, but he does increase it in its intensity as his speech continues. And I was thinking, you talk about the set of threes and the repetition. Like, isn't Caesar the one who said, "I came, I saw, I conquered"?
Yes.
Like, that is both like the anaphora and it's the three. And I guess that's a reason partly why it's so remembered.
Yeah, it's memorable for that reason. And apostrophe is one that I put there as well, which is when an orator will actually speak to the audience. You know, if there's a judge, you know, the orator might turn to the judge and say something, or turn even to the audience and say something. So when you directly speak, that's what that literary device is. And I would say that most people probably know what a rhetorical question is, right?
Sure.
Yeah. You ask a question, you don't expect anyone to answer, but you sort of answer it yourself.
Yep.
So these were things that the Romans used to make their speeches memorable, because again, people weren't looking at them, they weren't reading them.
Gotcha. And then you have this I had no clue about these hand gestures that were, I'm looking at those. I don't know.
You know, if you want, you know, silence, or if you're making a point, you do something like this. And, you know, if you're saying, "But wait, there's more," or something like this, very Italian, you know, "I can't believe," you know, or if you're really making a point, you're going to, you know, some of these things in different cultures mean other things, so I don't want to emphasize too much. But, you know, something like this, you're really trying to make a point, or if you think that something is just perfect. So I found this little graphic, and I thought it was really wonderful. My Latin 5 students always give a speech every year, and so they have to put appropriate gestures when they want silence, or when they're like waiting for response from, you know.
What do you make them give a speech about?
Really, the topic is almost irrelevant. It's mostly that they are proving their knowledge of rhetoric. So they have to use literary devices to try to convince their audience. Their goal is to get their audience to listen.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's a tough job. They get to live our hell, getting students to listen. Not a hell, I'm being over the top, hyperbolic. I'm sure that's a tactic that they would use as well, right?
Yes, absolutely.
So that kind of leads to the next slide. I wanted you talk a little bit about the context in which these speeches were delivered. And I'm familiar, I think all of my students are familiar with the Colosseum, but I don't think as many would be as familiar with the Forum.
Yeah. So in ancient Rome, the Forum was like the downtown part of the city. It was full of all of your public buildings, so your temples and your shops and government offices and those sorts of things. And very specifically, the vast majority of the speeches were either given in a basilica, which is a public building that had law courts and shops, or in the Curia, which was the Senate house. And so that was really only for senators, and later the emperor would be permitted to be present for those. But when any sort of speeches like law cases were tried, they were generally kind of open to the public. So slaves could be there, plebeians, which are the lower classes, patricians, if they were involved, they could be there. Or if you were just passing through, you could be there as well. And so what I think is really, really cool, I put these 2 photos here. These are steps of basilicae. And so common people, as they were listening to speeches, would stand on these steps, or sit on the steps, or stand near them, and they would play games. So one of the game boards on the left is sort of like checkers a little bit. The one on the right is more difficult to tell what it is. But people would pick up handfuls of gravel on the ground, and they would just throw them at those little holes carved to see if they could, get gravel into the little holes, just, to occupy their time while they were listening to a speech. I did not put a picture of the actual speaking platform. There was one of those too, which was for big announcements.
Gotcha. Ah, that's fascinating. And so, I mean, it's kind of reminiscent of how you can stand in line and be present for Supreme Court cases. I mean, you could go to just, you could be present for county like trials as well. I mean, I think the American legal system permits you to visit. It's just you can't boo and cheer or you'll get kicked out. But and obviously the value of evidence for the most part is more prioritized. But I guess still the ability of lawyers to be able to just emotionally connect with a jury, especially a jury, maybe not so much a judge, is still incredibly important. That's interesting. I wasn't even familiar with the curia. Is that how you say it? Yeah, that's fascinating. Well, I guess that leads to, I guess one of the last things I asked you about was who were some of the most famous orators. We've talked about Cicero plenty, but now you provided us a picture of the guy. I guess that's him in his older age.
Yeah, this is Cicero. This is definitely the most famous image of him. This is a statue in the Capitoline Museum in Rome. And he was by far the most famous orator. In fact, his Latin is considered to be the gold standard of Latin. My students who are in 5 and AP will say that his Latin is very difficult, which it is. It's very convoluted and it's very looping, partially because it's very, very full of those devices, you know, repetitions and tricolons and things like that. So that makes it a little bit difficult. And so Cicero was definitely the top of his game. He was the best of the best. But it would have been very, very, very difficult for him to do everything that he did. Keep in mind, in a world without electricity, without computing power, without even really convenient writing materials. And so he had a slave who helped him, whose name was Tiro. And Tiro is a very cool person. He invented shorthand so that he could take notes of what Cicero was saying while he was delivering his speeches. He had just boxes and boxes of wax tablets, which were like files on each of the different clients and each of the different cases, so that he could help Cicero accomplish what he did. And he had Cicero's speeches published after Cicero's death, which was, again, untimely because he didn't have role in Julius Caesar's assassination.
Okay, so the video is going to end right there. There were a few minutes of us talking after that, but as you can hear, the background noise was starting to get a little crazy with my son playing around in the background, and my wife was about to start a meeting. So I wanted to make sure I noted, again, thanks to Erin Prokopchak for being willing to talk with me about this. And I think it's interesting to try to find cross-curricular ways we can apply the skills in Lang and look at how these skills are indeed very timeless and relevant across different disciplines. So hope you enjoyed this. And again, thank you so much to Erin Prokopchak at John Champe High School for being game to participate in this.